A building's facthood, how much steel, how many bricks, how much aluminum, what's its schedule, quote, may in fact be a good way to shift contemporary discourse away from the idea that the beholder infuses life into architecture and toward the idea that the architectural objects have their own internal life. So on that note, I thought I would quickly share with you how much I enjoy close reading Neil's projects, and always do, and sort of discovering their internal life. On the upper left, New Keelung Harbor. You all know this project, a competition that Neil won in 2012 and is continuing. The project stood out for me immediately, not only because of its breakthrough in terms of overall graphic figuration of mass of the work, and in his body of work, but even more because of the littler discoveries. Here you see how he expands his own repertoire in this sort of window element, which his repertoire, which is great at negotiating wall to floor and making figural apertures, but now can suddenly bend figural apertures over mass corners. I've never seen this before in his work or in general, and now my eye goes to that particular feature every time I look at the project. And he does all of this with developable surfaces, which he himself has noted is one of his specific contributions to architecture, and the way that those developable surfaces roll over in strange and unexpected ways, I think, is crucial. Also, I don't know why this particular element has to happen, this move has to happen on exactly that location along the length of the port terminal. But I doubt it has to do with function. I would bet it has to do with the overall figuration of the object, but that there are probably vertical functional connections implied by the move that became accidentally useful, just a guess. HL23 on the right. This is his built project on the High Line. It's funny, I've been there and stared at this project, and even today, even at this moment, I can't say 100% that the white graphic frit pattern on the glass is always backed by an actual piece of structure, or if some of those moves are fake, in support of an overall flat reading of the building. Also, what does it even mean to put a graphic frit pattern on top of the glass with an inset structural frame and partially obscure it? What does it mean to do that? Not fully obscure it, but partially obscure it. There's no obvious answer to that. I've never talked to Neil about this, but it's also my guess that the predominant alignment of the graphic envelope with inset structure in this building is what triggered Neil to begin working on the new, more misfit relation of aperture to floor systems and structural systems that we've seen in more recent work, including Keelung and other projects. The pavilion project on the lower right, you guys saw this at the Right Now conference, and I remember that the discussion of the joint or lack thereof between the existing building and the pavilion was mentioned and discussed on the panel, and people found it odd and very intriguing. The move seems ad hoc, but it creates a great amount of tension and points to a kind of ruthless and fresh position in terms of ground and context and those kinds of relations. It's also much more difficult to achieve, technically speaking, than having a joint. And in knowing that, I find it even more intriguing as an architect that it had to be just that way. And finally, the Porsche Design Tower on the lower left. Look at that column at the middle, for one thing. At first glance, it seems like we're dealing with an exoskeletal structure, but then as you examine it more closely, it creeps up on you that these columns are broken and deviate laterally across the body of the building. We don't know if they carry any weight at all, if they're fictional, only Neil knows. They seem to serve instead to graphically tie the floors, the expressed floors, into a provisional mass. And what are those tight figural spaces running up the center of the mass? This is not housing. I think it's office function, yet they seem to imply something that might be identified with a housing typology. And finally, the apertures on the left side here, they seem to have total independence from the relentless horizontality of the floor plates. And they create an indeterminacy of scale that contradicts the human scale implied by the expressed floor plates in other locations. So anyway, I could go on and on, but I want to let Neil get on with the day's business, but I just wanted to point out that Neil's work allows for this kind of close reading because of its specificity, and in that sense, I think it's really exciting to have him here, I'm very excited to hear what he has to say about Thesis in general. So please welcome Neil to the stage. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to get into this. Okay, so thank you, Tom, very much for that. You know, it's always nice to know that your colleagues are reciprocating what I do, which is I spend a lot of time looking at other people's work. That sounds surprising sometimes to some people. Aren't you so busy, you know, doing your own work, and you know, you can only do your own work with the commitment that you have to study other people's work and to be a student. So everything's an eternal thesis project, and that's to a certain extent what I want to talk about today. Besides the fact that really studying and looking in today's world of consumerism and dilettantism, of which we're all guilty of it, becomes harder and harder. You need more and more pixels to see further into something, or you need plane tickets to go see something in real life so that you can produce your own pixels in the form of photographs and memories and so forth. But this is the world we live in, and the talk today is about thesis building, of course, building ideas. If you think about depicting a building, then you're building an idea. And if you're, I would say, depicting a building, then you're building an idea too. And those kinds of symmetries are what's going on in the idea of thesis building, because of course we could title it Building a Thesis. And I want to talk about the thing that's probably the most difficult for you to understand, and that's how do ideas that are relevant get transposed into architecture. And just maybe it's a little bit of a continuation of the introduction, a small anecdote to begin. I won't indulge you too far in that personally. This is the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth by Louis Kahn. And after Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect that every kid in America knows, especially from my time period, Wright died, I think, a couple years after I was born, but his fame, sort of lived on. Kahn was the second architect that I found out about, and I was really interested in becoming an architect from a very early age. Now, the reason why I know this building, it's in my hometown, and a block away from this building, my father owned an art gallery. He was a weekend art dealer, and in addition to his job as a manager in engineering, aerospace engineering. So I watched, as it were, this building being built, and I heard about Kahn through newspaper articles, and the building eventually was finished in 1971, right around the time of his death. And I remember thinking and looking at this project going, well, I don't really get it. It looks old, right? Barrel vaults, arches, what does that have to do with the New World? And the New World, especially where I grew up, which was instant suburbia and Sun Belt cities and so forth, and especially being involved in the periphery, shall we say, of aerospace. This building seemed to be oddly anachronistic, and I wasn't so enamored with the amount of time that I had to spend in it, almost like 2 weekends a month, because my parents were art lovers, and so I know this building inside and out. Now, that was around 1971 and 1972, and in 1975, the summer before I went off to study architecture undergraduate, and this is obviously long before the internet, and what I had was a secondhand bookstore to go into the city and buy old copies of architectural record and progressive architecture. That was the only media you could get for anything new. I discovered that I.M. Pei had designed a house for one of the kind of wealthy business owners in Fort Worth, Texas, and I don't know how I did it. Somehow I tracked down the neighborhood that it was built in, and I went on this trip across town to go see the I.M. Pei house. And I drove by the I.M. Pei house and I saw it, and it was a big concrete box and it had a big sloped roof on it, and I was kind of, wow, is that all it is? I was kind of very deflated. So I got in my car and I drove down the street and I turned the corner and then something happened. And that's what I saw. I saw this house by Paul Rudolph. I know you've never seen it because this house was never published, because it was also a house for an oil baron in Texas named Mr. Bass, and he had reached out to Paul Rudolph, a New York architect, to do this sublime, de Stijlian, levitating white house. And this is not quite the state I saw it. It was finished. This was 1975. It was finished in 72, but there were no trees yet around it. Today, if you drive by, of course, it's all in a forest built up. And, you know, internet or no internet, you know, world of access or not, if you're a 17-year-old kid who's deciding to be an architect and you see this and you think, wow, this is out of this world, yet here it is right in front of me in all its palpable kind of glory. And all I could see was unthinkable cantilevers, and all I could see was an incredible level of coherence, even though I hadn't studied architecture yet. And when I looked at this, I said, this is what I want to do. For sure. This is, I want to do this. I want to try to exceed it. And it was just a moment of pure, overwhelming obsession with seeing something real, because until this time, I had to see a Philip Johnson building from time to time, because in Texas, there were no local architects. And so Pei, Johnson, corporate architects were called in. Rudolph had done another building I discovered later on. But this project was just an overwhelming moment, and I think maybe it was not the reason, but it's something that catalyzed the idea of looking at a building, all white, knowing and reading its form, being able to understand it in terms of its materiality. You could see the profiles of the steel, obviously all the glass, all the mullions and everything. It was made out of parts and pieces, and it seemed unreal and real all at the same time. I had to rub my eyes to make sure it was real, because it was totally unexpected. It's harder and harder to be shocked today, and I'm thank God that I was at that time. It's interesting also to look at the previous image versus this image, and the one-point perspective versus the two-point perspective, and Rudolph's splintering of space, you know, that plays out over time in his work. And maybe you don't know too much about Rudolph because he became less cared for, I think, by the media. He had a challenging personality, as we know. But I show you this just because I think there's something very, very important about this for me. Okay, so I want to get to the point of the talk, and I'll start with this idea of positions. And I think Tom used this word position. A few important political and intellectual projects in the 20th century, and then, like a roller coaster, we're on a track, but we're going to make loop-de-loops and we're going to make swerves and stuff, but we're on a track. That's what kind of lecture this is. So the start of the track is this, and don't worry, it's not going to be some, you know, heavy, long historical reappraisal. I can only imagine that Marcelin's lectures to set the stage have been incredibly panoramic and very, very powerful, for sure. And I won't dare endeavor to imagine how to go above that. I'm just giving you my personal sort of thinking. So 5 points of architecture, when you think about it, so free plan, free facade, pilotis, horizontal window, and a roof garden. What's interesting is the spirit of the times and the development of 5 points came out of materials. It didn't come out of abstract concepts. It came directly from materials. And with the development of the steel frame, the domino frame, and of course this is the apotheosis of all of those points we know it. Corb had built projects through the 1920s, and other architects as well. You're asking, well, could you today make a manifesto purely out of new materials? Do we have the kind of new materials that would allow a paradigmatic shift in architecture that would completely erase and supplant so that you could develop 5 more new points? Because when you're thinking about thesis, you're thinking, what's new? What can I find myself connected to? And curiously, when you think about, let's say, material research, you might also, unconsciously or not, get further and further detached from architecture because the material becomes a self-referential fetish. And we've seen a lot of that today. So the beginning of this conversation is that materials connected to architecture, and I think Tom's intro was right. Material doesn't mean the real. Material doesn't strictly mean the disciplined. Material basically means matter that you have to work with to make a proposition. Now the challenge is you don't know a lot about materials. You're just in your 5th year, you've done a few things. The world out there looks real to you, but in here it remains abstract. Not out of fear of not wanting to confront the material. A lot of it has to do with just not knowing about what they are. Okay, so fast forward about 40-something years. This is James Stirling building a dormitory in Oxford for Oxford University. And I'm showing you buildings that I love. Tom allowed me to say, can I show buildings that I love? And I'm going to put them into context beyond, just that I love them. So buildings on columns, taking a pure octagonal form, slicing it apart. It's facing a river. It's got a bizarre context because it's impacted on the one hand by nature and by other university buildings. The ribbon window, of course, by this time is turned into, well, advanced at that time, this is in 1971, into curtain wall design. So you see the concrete frame, that's not altogether completely disclosing everything that's going on. You can see how it supports and buttresses this chamfered form. And to me, what's curious about this project, when you start to study it from the inside and from the outside, the ceramic terracotta tile that you see here is glued on to the surface of the building. It's not a load-bearing material at all. And you can see the ribbon windows wrapping around, and if there's anything I've learned about windows, it's when the window connects to the stair. And while it's not a direct reference, I would say that that's an unconscious reference for some of the things that I've been doing with the idea of hybrid glazing systems. So the stratification happens on the one hand, but the material actually is very, very thin, so in terms of the skin. So the relationship between what we might see as bona fide structure in the expression of modernism, pilotis letting the landscape move underneath and so forth. This is Stirling saying something like, well, I'm a modern architect, and he didn't invent the manifesto like the early modernists did, but they're working on a problem. And all architects have interests. You have interests, and generally when you start out to think about your thesis, you go, I'm interested in my hometown, or I'm interested in my own personal history. The challenge I think that your faculty has given you is your interests are fine, your interests are great, your talents are good and all of that, but mostly we might not care about them unless an architect, and in this case Stirling, is trying to essentially work on the problems that modernism set up. He wasn't the originator of a manifesto, and in this sense, materials become a continuing site of investigation to play out, let's say, the 5 points of architecture. I find this building just utterly fascinating and beautiful, and it's been an influential project for me, I would say, over the last 7 or 8 or 9 years, while you can still extract Corbusian principles from it. Now, Frank Gehry, we have to talk about Frank very early on in this lecture, and I'm going to oscillate between older stuff and absolutely brand new stuff and contemporary stuff, so that we can kind of understand that buildings are buildings. They have life and value, and old and new, etc. But does this pointer work? No, it doesn't matter right now. Okay, old materials, new delivery. You know this project, this insane 10, 15-year project to realize this. I'm sure that wasn't a question of Francois Pinault not having the money over all this time. It was probably a lot of political conditions going into it. They built it in the Bois de Boulogne in a public park. You can think about the politics, you can think about all of the problems that would go into it, and probably less about the fact of building it, although over 10 years in Gehry's office, what happens, of course, is they're working on new ways to build what he designs from a very intuitive point of view. Now, Frank Gehry, as you know, Frank Gehry never wrote a manifesto, never wrote a series of rules or principles that could ever be put into a handbook, right? And you either love it or you hate it. He came out of the idea of I'll hang out with artists and not architects, and that was for 2 reasons. One, professional. Architects don't get me jobs, number one. Number 2, ideas about art which are liberated from, let's say, theoretically, the problematics of architecture would be the way into a new architecture, because Frank never painted. He's designed furniture, but he's very little deviated from being what he always was an architect, building hundreds of buildings, many of them that still exist out there that you could drive by and you wouldn't even know they were a Gehry building. When you look at this project and you think about its glass and wood and a certain type, I mean, the cladding system is maybe some new hybrids of cladding material, but in essence, when you look at this whole project, you can imagine, here's Frank, you know how he designs. He designs as a sculptor, he designs intuitively. Program is set out and managed by a team. And his project is, whether he would say it's just simply about, producing a new world or producing sculptural space, those terms don't actually sound like a thesis to me. I'm interested in these kinds of things. So in a way, I put this work out there to say that Frank has consciously detached himself from agendas historically in the discipline and let the work, literally say everything that it's going to say. And if you look at this project about, in relation to the problems and the tendencies, ambiguity, legibility, the project of the ground plane and all of that, this is a really important thing to think about, and here's where I'm here to, let's say, solidify the arguments of this thesis here, which I think is very important. And that is, you're in your 5th year, you have your interests, and if they just let you play with your interests, either you wouldn't have the virtuosity to make something which on its own would generate its own connection to the discipline, maybe a few of you. It's better to kind of think about you working within problems and scenarios and conditions which other people have helped determine so that you can make a contribution to that, to relieve you of either the anxiety of total originality or total propriety. That's why they're doing this. And I think that's brilliant because in many respects you could look at somebody like Frank as a thesis student with no thesis to be spoken because he's just playing out his interests and has for a long time. But over all of this time, and when you think about all of the effort to be able to get to this project and this new delivery system where it's not necessarily Frank himself looking at the joint in detail with all the stiffeners and the gusset plates between the glue lam beams and the steel. He has a team that does that. But you might look at that, or I might look at all of this and say, that's so fascinating on an engineering level that while that's about materials and techniques, you're almost wondering if I could find a thesis project out of that. But I show you these things also because buildings are made out of materials that have existed for some time. So new material phenomena happens from time to time, but even when Le Corbusier set out 5 points, the paradigmatic shift of a set of materials to build buildings, even for the near future, has not yet been supplanted, which is not for me to say that you shouldn't speculate on what they are. Now, this is the Taichung Opera House by Ito. I call it handcrafted computation. And you know this project probably pretty well, where there's a program and it's got big voids and big spaces, and usually they're enclosed and they have acoustic properties, and then there's lobby spaces, and you're thinking of a kind of binary between front of the house and back of the house and so forth. So Ito endeavors to say on the topological project, well, it's all going to be one and the same. And the front is the back, and the back is the front. And I'll be able to just deal with architecturalness from a couple of standpoints. One, I'm going to just trim it by the site into a rectangular box, and that's one of the things that Ito does. Ito takes a glove and he turns it inside out. Sometimes he puts free worlds insides of boxes. Sometimes he puts boxes insides of free worlds. Generally, he deals in either contrast or self-similarity of grids, or is a very, very, very good architect to look at in the gestalt, of his work. Okay, and we've all been wondering, well, what is this going to turn out to be as a building, because it seems so speculative and so conceptual to say, well, I'm going to use minimal surface project, and I'm going to force program to work within it. And in many respects, when you see the glazing in between, straightforward. The green, I'm not a fan of green glass when it seems like it was some default. There's the stratified floors and the contrast between the kind of Mobius inside-outside, the anonymous material with the perforations in it. Of course, the idea here, whether it's intentional or not, is the glazing. The glazing is a forthright either explanation of a building or a capitulation, I don't know. And everything else, especially when it becomes pseudo-seamless, in a relationship between the concrete shell and so forth. Knowing that this is how it was made, that's a chaotic photograph, and that's a photograph probably that you just don't even want to look at. You look at it and you go, somebody's got a bunch of rebar. I'm not sure if all of that rebar, part to part, it's not rolled through a machine. It's out by hand where the topologies, the topographies, the set out points and everything that's going on, you know, is lasered into place, and then there's a team trying essentially to make this project materially stand up. This is shotcrete. They build a solid surface underneath and spray the concrete into the form. So in essence, when you go inside this building, you're looking at the smooth surfaces of the topology. There's Ito-san, apparently happy with the. I think he's happy because it's getting built. I think he could probably look away from any, you know, kind of craft issues in a way. There's a column in the middle, right? Does the column annoy you? You probably are looking at it and going, well, I wish that column weren't there. That column is a real heavy reminder of some other subsystem where the engineer couldn't get the thickness of the shotcrete to work or span just on its own terms, and a column had to be introduced. Now, that's either a sad thing, or it's a, you turn it the other way and go, well, look, you know, that column, for me personally, it does very little to kill the ambition of the project. And that's some of the differences between not being real and being naive. It's really about understanding with architecture that having concepts and turning them into buildings is a process. It's not a one-to-one conversion. You're not just dealing with surfaces and therefore they have capacity, you know, at some level. You look at all the scaffolding and so forth. So it's powerful, I think, to look at architecture, again, in its real terms, not as a reminder or a ballast or something like between the fake and the real, but between what ambition is about. Now, this is a building by Bentham Crowell, probably not an office that you know. They're quite well known working in Amsterdam. Mels Crowell is the son of Wim Crowell, who's a good friend of mine and like the Oscar Niemeyer of graphic design. He's in his mid-80s now, and I've gotten a chance to know him and go see them in their office and so forth. And this is an extension to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and the new played out in the old, and you look at that and say, well, these kinds of things might strangely happen in places like China, but a liberal society like Holland, you know, says, sure, put what they call the bathtub, to put the bathtub next to, you know, the old Stedelijk Museum. And here, you know, without much, this is not an office that writes manifestos or would typically be seen as having a project. And I show it here just about materiality because what they did was, this building is built out of vast flat panels which were produced in Japan, like big pieces of drywall almost, except very large and very stiff. And they're screwed on to the face of the framing. All of the curved pieces, of course, were precast and so forth. And what they do is I don't have any construction photographs. They fastened it to the building, and literally, just almost like drywall, at the seams between the panels, there's beveling, and like a car body, a team comes in and essentially fills in with a self-similar kind of material, and they sand the joints away, and then of course it's painted. And the ambition, no joints, right? So it's a project on materials on the one hand, and I'm constantly talking about materials in relation to Villa Savoye, and how far new materials can give you an architectural project versus a project that's got an idea. To get rid of the joints on a building and to do everything you can to get rid of the joints on the building so that I don't think the form's that particularly great or powerful, anything like that. Most of it had to be flat because the panels were destined to be made that way. Oh, well, is a joint-free project a thesis? I would say no. It's a material exploration, but I don't see the idea of the limitation of the panel in this case as the excuse to say that nothing more happened with the project. So materials, old or new or versions of one or the other of existing types of materials, this is like doing an interior partition in the scale of an exterior building. You would have to work much, much harder than they did to put it into a longer context about defamiliarization, about alienation, about the lack of perception that you take away when you lose joints in a project in terms of being able to perceive a building like on the left, which is made of many pieces and many joints versus none. It would only become a thesis if you could prove that that had novelty and value in some other way. You couldn't just say, I like new materials, I want to get rid of joints, and that's my project. Does that make sense? This is future systems in the Lord's cricket ground in London, and it's another project just to talk about materiality and shape. This is a different type of construction system. This is a semi-monocoque construction, and I'm sure you know what that is, being at SCI-Arc, where it's a prefabricated building. There's an internal former and stringer system and a stress skin. It's made in a boat factory in various pieces. It's pre-painted. It's taken out to the site. It fits together perfectly because it's essentially a piece of industrial design brought to the level of architecture in a very, very discrete way where everything can be controlled. Now, in many respects, with future systems being, Jan Kaplitzky was Czech and not British, but he worked effectively in the British scene of high tech, where the idea of minimum surface, a kind of curious early ecology, meeting construction systems which are about technology transfer, trying to critique architecture's, limit, and take, a building on columns with a horizontal glass project and a particular type of opacity. This directly stems from Villa Savoye in many, many ways. And part of some of the arguments that I would come back to are how everybody emanates from, and most people emanate from these particular projects. This is Kaplitzky's last project in Modena in France for a Ferrari museum. I was never personally, I wanted to always be totally captivated with their work, but what was curious about it is it always had a kind of, I would say, ambition to be both, I would say an ambition to more in the end be designed by self-logic and self-form finding, like minimum surface for maximum interior envelope, which people like Foster and Arabs together developed that. And that sort of one-to-one isomorphism, sometimes plays out a little bit, I think, at the end of Kaplitzky's work in terms of trying to keep up with the project of the fluid, which you see here. Now, this project by Heatherwick for Shanghai. I guess Heatherwick is not an architect, but he's doing more architecture than most architects. Good for him, I suppose. It's a bit strange maybe to be showing this project, but I show it just because if you think about material effects, and this project, I didn't see the interior. I've seen images of the interior which seem a little, let's say, underwhelming. Like, I wish that this was only an inaccessible void or inaccessible solid, because, of course, this is the entire effect of the project. And its, form might have been almost anything, but when you look at the photograph and you see the kind of big cruciform that plays out depending on where the camera is and how it articulates almost this kind of line work. Material effects. This is existing fiber optic material deployed into, let's say, some sort of novel effect. It too probably still doesn't give you a thesis project, but materials are still viable at some level to be able to investigate as that, but it would have to find its grounding in some other way. And again, I'm going to continue to talk about materials because buildings are made of materials, and the thing that I've got to get you to think about is that's not some professional attribute. It's a whole toolkit of things to be able to unlock a project. Now, here's a project where I'll talk about material in relation to a concept, not a concept that Hitoshi invented. This is the Kano Museum in around Sendai. He built this before he came to LA. And it's a Corten steel dimpled waffle system. And he argued, could he offer something to the project on the idea of the soap bubble project. Now, while a lot of people said, I need to build the soap bubble so that it looks like a soap bubble, I need to have the minimum surfaces work the way they are because I need a one-to-one visual relationship. You could think about the water cube in Beijing, or you could think of a million projects from student projects, because this is such a captivating image to say, God, if architecture could only be truly liquid and continuous, and every joint could be dynamic and forceful, and materials, however they would work, would be able to produce a space which, on the one hand, you could argue something like, I always looked at soap bubble projects as the materialization of the web, which is you're only on a website, and then you're on another website, and there's no space in between except for the time that it takes to load, which is, if you have a good computer, it's nothing. So the space of the web is only always about space and never about moving from one space to another. And that's a bit like the world that we live in, right? If you take an email, if you take an whatever it is, in theory, you're always where you're supposed to be, and there's no journey to get to anything, right? So to me, I looked at this as anybody trying to make a soap bubble project, this is just my reading, is to say this is the paradigm of the world. There's no more circulation. It's only place form all the time. So in order to do that, he said, okay, well, how am I going to build that? And if there's not going to be circulation systems and then exhibition systems in this small museum, and it's only going to be space all the time, then he said, well, how can I get rid of the partition between the spaces, at least in terms of materials? So when you look at these images, you can say, to be able to do that, I have to forget about curvature, for instance, because I'm not interested in that. I'm only interested in being able to conceive of the project. And here's all the sort of pieces to the puzzle, and they put it up on the site, and they weld it. And these two panels, which are dimpled, the dimpling, every one of them had a hole in it, so that a robot could go in and put a weld at each one of those dimples to make a rigid sandwich. So if you think about it, it's like soap bubble space, and this was Hitoshi's concept. How do I get there? I need to make it out of steel. What's the best way for steel to operate, to become thin but rigid? You can't keep thickening the wall section of the steel. It has to have a void in it. It has to become like a sandwich. You develop it, and this is what it turns out to be. So this is a really beautiful project. And while there is circulation, the circulation always happens within a bubble, and you get to another bubble, and you turn the corner, and you're in another bubble, and that's what it is. Somebody could say that's like an old-fashioned enfilade museum. You go from room to room to room. That's one way of looking at it. But in this particular case, with multiple itineraries, and it's not a linear project, then the nonlinear project, in terms of its only space all the time, was a material execution. So one of the things that we have to worry about in all of this is, literalism and so forth, and we all have our tangents to the literal. Okay. So Mies and moral modernism and universal space, and I think his face says it all. It's like, do not fuck around with anything else but this. And he was quite serious. This is the model of Crown Hall. You look at Crown Hall, and at least in this particular picture, you can see a little bit of reflection of the interior of the space, but quite honestly, the glass almost looks non-existent. And there's the structural frame, and the glass is the idea of the immaterial world, and the idea that everything could be placed into a project where freedom, which comes from some of the modernist logic of designing for the epoch, designing for the time. This is also sort of a new material project as well. Mies was less interested in opacity. Mies was less interested in the figure of the window and only interested in the idea of a pure enclosure. Now, here's a thesis project. This is Philip Johnson. He was wealthy, of course, and he bought a site in Cambridge, and he built his own house. And it's a pretty generic project when you look at it. There's a glass house that's backed up against one side of this courtyard, a 9-foot wall, and a garden and trees. Now, everybody at GSD, after Gropius got to Harvard, were just learning modernism, and they were learning modernism in certain principles. It was the ultimate idea of a thesis as a final project, because all of the ideology had been supplied to every student. There was no, in 1945 at Harvard, they didn't walk in and go, "So Philip, what's your project?" Philip goes, "Here's my project. I do it as well as I can." Harry Cobb did one. Paul Rudolph did one. Everybody did one. Here's my contribution. Even through the 60s, Stanley Tigerman at Yale, here's my contribution to modernism. Now today we don't have an easy monolithic world to just turn your project into a vocational discourse such as this. And I'm not saying it's bad, this is just what was going on in the time, right? Because the 5 points or Mies or whatever laid it all out for you. Now what's curious is in a world of incredible diversity, if your critics left it to you to choose, to act on your propriety, I'm telling you, you would suffer the tyranny of choice. You would suffer because you would actually want some framework, and that's why they're giving you the framework. Because this is a way to be able to cut the difference between a wild free space of choice and a monolithic logic of only doing something one way. I think there's incredible diversity in the way in which this thesis is operating that allows you to have choice, but there are still limits to what it is to be able to put you into a culture of our architectural discourse so that your project can contribute, but hopefully have the potential for novelty involved as well. So here's Mies, here's Rem, and yeah, it's Mies at Cornell, and Rem's politics of persuasion of modernism, which of course take not universal space one-to-one, but then supply data or other type of particular phenomena that drive a kind of Dutch Calvinist, this is the only way in which it can be. Now, Mies's moral modernism was, this is the only way in which it can be, and there was a set way of doing it. Rem's way of dealing with persuasion and go, it can only be this way, is using just their modernism, and when I say just their modernism, that's what he actually calls it. When somebody said, what do you think about modern architecture? He goes, it's just there. So just their modernism is his medium to then put into a politics of persuasion that says it's the only way in which it can be. A levitating big rectangle can be the only thing that can mediate between, the chaos of all of the existing buildings, and also knowing this building had 4 or 5 other architects or authors playing out. This is the Toledo Glass Museum, and Sana, also, you would say, a bit like Frank Gehry, they don't write theories, they don't make manifestos, and they hope that in their ambition, and like other Japanese architects, to rid architecture of material, which of course means using glass, which we know, of course, depending on times of day, creates, as you see here, a mirror effect on one side and the shady side, some transparency, all the trees reflecting and so forth. And we know that material life in architecture, even for Mies, even despite his model that showed no actual apparent affect in it, has all of this stuff, playing on it. But I'm not sure that it's a thesis project. It could be, but I think as they practice it, it's not, in terms of old materials trying to be played out in new ways. Maybe if somebody wrote a text for them, it could turn into a thesis project, but as practiced, it's not. And this is Schumi with a relatively early project, I would say, in Switzerland for it was a video museum. It was a Folly Pavilion, which I think wasn't supposed to be permanent. And here you can see, probably on a Chinese New Year moment, where, like an aquarium, almost like a weird Jeff Koons project, these pieces are placed into it. And it's pretty clear that you're only supposed to look at the red Chinese lanterns, and architecture is just simply supposed to be an immaterial project where glass is connected with the smallest amount of stainless steel clips, structure doing whatever it has to do to be able to produce the antagonistic diagonal project, which we know still has avant-garde tendencies to let's say, change perception of what you see in the city around. So in some ways, this is a collapse of an avant-garde project for difference played out in the benign, soft world, I should say, of glass, which in and of itself is not supposed to affect anything. It's not supposed to offend. It's not supposed to give you any reading with anything. And so the gestalt of this, though, is, I would say Bernard is really trying to make a thesis out of this project. Venturi has been a part of the studio, especially the texts, maybe not his projects. And one thing to make clear, though, is this is very much a project about a thesis. And it's a thesis that comes out of, I think, 2 things. One, Venturi was an East Coast guy, probably well-heeled, probably raised fairly conservatively, a bow tie-wearing intellectual who has his interests. He likes shingle-style architecture. He just likes it. But then he scratches his head and says, well, that's not a thesis project. I need to put those interests into a conversation on architecture. And that's what a thesis is. I don't give a shit that he likes shingle-style houses. I like the understanding of what the shingle-style houses do in relation to a political agenda of what architecture should be about. So, of course, he was distressed about modernism's rigidity, and even though he's recanted later in his life on Mies about the boredom of the empty project, and he couldn't tolerate nothing. He wanted everything. He wanted more things going on because he thought that's what life is. Life is not to be disciplined by architecture's rules, right? So in many respects, the reason why we would reread Venturi is because you'd almost think rules, and I know at SCI-Arc they're always supposed to be made to be broken, and but rules in their own rigid way do prevent life at some particular level. So all of the games going on, there's the kitchen on the right with the cabinets in front of the windows. I've learned a lot about windows obscuring interiors, specifically from Venturi in this project. It took a long, long time to have the same nerve to deal with indiscriminacy of interior space to aperture, because you just think that's wrong. And here was an architect who said it was not only okay, but made a project out of it, and symmetries and so forth. And this is a 1966 proposal for a house, again, the hypertrophic chimney, but the house lifted up on a column negotiating the slope. There's not that much going on, but there's a lot going on at the same time. The way the sloping pitched roofs are truncated in very, very specific ways, as you see just right here on the corner, to create an relatively odd side elevation profile. These are pretty profound projects that came out of a thesis, which was a critical thesis about, I would say, a populist manifesto. And my favorite building by Venturi and Roch in Columbus, with the chimney becoming the sign. Obviously very much a formal element, but when you go down into the lateral form of the building, where the dumb stuff that plays out, the black painted door, the slight ribbon window, again the cruciform window with stuff in front of it, and the unavoidable big door, all compromised by glazed brick and red brick, besides the fact that it also starts to push everything up into a single surface, which he uses, of course, in many, many buildings later on, but only through the rhetoric of classicism. This was really a project, and especially at this particular time, of trying very desperately to write a theory about difficult holes and things that don't quite add up, and ambiguity and so forth. All the terms that we today feel like are inherent in the work, and of course in learning from Las Vegas, taking populism even further. Okay, we have to talk about Eisenman, and I should move a lot faster, I think. Critical project. So part of the reason to talk about Eisenman, as here in his 60s projects, where he really falls in love with the language and communication and rhetorical texts of Chomsky, multiplied times his reading of Causa del Fascio in relation to, let's say, French / Corbusian modernism, where grids and frames are working much, much more as abstract devices rather than strict or explicit ways in which mass is set on columns to liberate ground. These houses, which also well, and need the countryside to be able to set them off so that the kind of purist spirit of the White House is still in play. But the self-referential project, the project that would only speak about itself, that would reject every other possible force or influence on architecture, was a radical idea. You'd think that it would be the last thing that an architect would do, and of course Eisenman enjoyed that position. To speak about the last or the end or the first or today it is no longer, if you read all of Eisenman's texts, their pretext excludes or includes or cuts away and creates a limited paradigm that in and of itself can only be seen as a critical project. So here in House 6, the kind of apotheosis in built form, and building I want to talk about with Eisenman has always been understood as being a tense relationship between his work as an architect, his work as a theorist, and what the legacy of the built work is. Some would say the built work, there might not be that much legacy if you look at the totality of it. If you drive by in Columbus, Ohio, and see the convention center, it might not be a wow project. Maybe none of them are seen that way, but we have to talk about these projects as the classical form of a conceptual project that gets materialized. And in some respects, we'd all like to think that the most sublime thesis would be the most intense conceptual project, brought to life. But Eisenman and Eisenman's work doesn't necessarily endeavor to conclude that, shall we say, but it's something to look at. Eisenman worked with grids, Sol LeWitt in New York and an earlier era, but definitely a contemporary time frame where LeWitt's work was simply about structure, and white grids provided two things. One, an automatic sign form for the intellectual project just on its own terms, because there's no self involved in this. There are choices being made about an artist's interest, but the white grid is essentially a language or a medium to talk about ideas on an intellectual framework. And if you look at Donald Judd and other artists, they chose that work because that was a medium to be able to make a conceptual project happen. Now, this is Joseph Kosuth, his famous chair piece, ontic structure, which I think is another theme that probably has been coursing through the studio, where the self-referential project, and here in a kind of found element, in many respects, between this project and a LeWitt grid, is all that Eisenman needs to be able to play out a project that's a project that says, my architecture has nothing to do with any other architecture. My architecture only has to do with itself. It only has to do with its own internal reference system and its own internal language, and how you deal with it is only either to the extent that you understand that, or even if you're alienated by it, but those are the terms by which the work plays out. Now, as Eisenman goes on, this is a site plan for Rebstock Park in Frankfurt for a housing project where the width of the figure, of course, is I don't know if it's a single-loaded or a double-loaded project, but so these are U-shaped, L-shaped, slab-shaped housing projects that when you have a specific site, the material of the program is very, very quickly transposed into Zipatone because it's pure sausage, it's pure repetition, and it's subjected to, of course, the discourse of how the grids and the line work on the site are played out. Now, this is not this is my association and my reference. This is Frank Stella, What You See Is What You See, 1960s paintings, where at that particular time, the crisis in painting, of course, was about subject matter and about technique and so forth, and also the rectangular canvas. So a shaped canvas, not a rectangular canvas, offset lines which mean nothing. They only, like a series of topographies that unflinchingly describe the perimeter of the painting, painted in a color that nobody makes any association with. And that's all it is. Trying to rid painting, just like Eisenman's tried to rid architecture, of a lot of meaning. Now, Eisenman ran out of territory on that project. The grid continues to be used and appropriated as a sign form for the intellectual project, but of course, by the time the 80s roll around and he's dealing with issues of memory, excavation, invoking far more than just formalism in modernism, but his Jewishness takes over, working in places like Berlin on multiple occasions. It's interesting how he can transpose, as it were, projects that involve narrative, storytelling, metaphors, and so forth within a form-making system that, on the one hand, hasn't remained the same necessarily. I haven't been to this project. This is the one in Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and I think this is the, his sort of largest, crowning achievement. Well, his largest project, I would say, crowning achievement. We'll have to wait and see. I haven't been there, and grids are persistent in his work, as you know that, even if they're only lightly embossed in a stone surface, or they might be embossed in a stucco wall on a building, but they're there. And in many respects, the grid is a remainder from all of his work in terms of the sign form for language and rhetoric. And here, over all these years, are the fastidious and stubborn ways in which either contemporary landscape design meets other kind of storytelling metaphors about ground, of which I know ground is one of your last projects to work on. And when you look close at the project as a building, in many respects, I think from a construction point of view, the thing about Eisenman is that he's always endeavored to try to force materials into a level of irreality, right? To try to make them as close to a drawing as possible. And House 6 was that. And while there's, stones and landscape and so forth, and if you look at any of that, you might say, well, that's deeply of the earth and very familiar. But of course, the shock is when you put it into this kind of context. The issues of whether or not, as an architect, you read it as successful in terms of producing the irreal or making a landscape become a project where even when you look at the curtain walls are difficult. They create a kind of ballast in many ways on legibility, and that's why I think that figuring out how to understand the limits of construction, at least in my case, so that craft never gets in the way of reading the concept. Craft gets in the way a lot on Eisenman projects, and that's why I personally have a much different point of view on that. No Stop City by Superstudio, late 60s. Suburbia is happening even in northern Italy. They're radicals, they hate it. It's the project of consumerism, of American exploitation. They're radicals, fuck that. So what do? We're gonna give you more of what you already suffer from, which is nausea and self-similarity. So they make these drawings, and if you don't know this project, you owe it to yourself to buy it. It's a canonical project. It's beautiful. The text is just important as the images because it lays out a radical critique with no solution because these images are essentially producing, not even a speculative project, but an emblem, a mirror, as I say, to define architecture in pure problematic states. And it is on its own terms not simply a project about we're going to build this, but it's an architectural project, highly speculative, of course, using banal, repetitive fields where repetition and scale produce, that's the level of unreality that freaks you out. When you zoom into the smallest element, all it is a column and a toilet and a parking space and a tree, right? Extracting everything out of that. Now, you'd only be able to do this project if you were angry at the world. You'd only be able to convert this into a thesis, but, well, that was part of what was going on at the time. Now, I have to talk about Himmelb. Partly, my own interest, and it's a way to invoke, I think, Tom's history as well. So here's is that Wolf? Yeah, right there? Okay, so this is 1968, let's say. And which one is Helmet in there?
That's not Helmet, right?
That's not Himmelb, but that's Wolf, right? Okay. Has Wolf been here to see everybody? You know. So this is in Vienna, of course, around the same time as Superstudio are dealing with a different type of project. In Italy, they had Tafuri later and Bruno Zevi, and especially Tafuri, a young Tafuri, neo-Marxist critics, to be able to help them outline a resistive project. But still, in a way, they're architects and they're desperate to design something. So for Wolf, the history of action art in Austria and happenings in New York and so forth was, you know, Revo Festo, the Revolution Manifesto. And architecture is old. It can't work. It can't sustain. And so action and movement can only be new. So architecture here, of course, takes the form of an inflatable, the most nothing you could design but still have something, and then they play out this. This little girl seems incredibly happy that this ball is chasing her, but may or may not be a staged image. But like conceptual art, these projects, of course, live on in these images and in the minds of everybody who took them on. But more than anything, they represent no architecture, because architecture was a dead medium, too bureaucratic, too disciplined by even materiality and so forth. This is Flaming Lips, if you're into them, but that's Wayne Coyne, and he still likes to make these events, and I enjoy that a lot. So here's Himmelb saying, well, fuck, we are architects, and while we've run around in balloons, maybe the next step is to take the balloon and discipline it in a way, and then deal, of course, in what we were doing in the street, horrifying people or wondering what the hell they were doing, and put it into what we know is very, very powerful about an avant-garde project, which is contrast. Here's your context, and here's my project, because, you know, without that context, I don't have anything. And if you think about it, Eisenman's context of nature on the one hand in his White Houses he wasn't dealing in a project of opposition. He was only dealing with a project of pure self-reference. By this time, by the time you get to trying to figure out what architecture is going to be in a new medium, it needs all the context to work with. It needs all the repressive structures of culture. It needs stone upon stone of 18th and 19th century Vienna to be able to play out, and even the transparency of the figure. That's Haus Rucker on the right. More bubbles going on. Bubbles we know were happening, and bubbles still remain interesting because they are part architecture and part manifesto and part nothingness all at the same time. And another architect who wasn't a May 68 architect at all. In fact, he was an engineer, and you know, Fuller, just sitting around making drawings going, how can I make something light? How can I make something efficient? And how do the laws of nature work? And here he makes his geodesic sphere in 1967. So bubbles are everywhere in the 60s. Bubbles in the hands of radicals are one type of bubble, and in the hands of a bow-tied engineer from Illinois who just wants to make a new paradigmatic architecture, probably doesn't even want to anger anybody, says, well, here's my contribution to that. And Fuller goes on to work more conventionally in unbuilt projects, in this one for Triton City. Paul Rudolph comes back into play because he's actually trying to build, in some ways, some of the agendas of all of these projects in the 1960s. So I'm separating out ambitions in terms of political agency to engender a project, and projects that on their own terms are continuations of the modern political agency of, let's say, New Life, and in this case, with Rudolph in terms of self-similarity and modularity, which can be related to a lot of the things that Fuller was doing at the time. And this is a very cool building from the early 70s. Now, just before that, this is a model that represents what was called the function of the oblique by Parent and Vrilio, French architect and theorist from 1966. And you can see a lot of things going on in this project, which was essentially the X and the Y are dead, and the only thing that matters is everything in between. And in fact, you know, their big symbol was a big X, and Wolf has liked X's, I know, for a long time. And the X both kills and cancels out, and it also adjusts the normative of this world. So you can look at the X in quite a lot of ways, and this particular project was a deeply conceptual project about, well, how are we going to adopt the in-between? How are we going to adopt continuity and the diagonal? And these honeycomb sections, you know, they've occurred over a long period of time. But I would say that this was a thesis, a conceptual thesis project that in many ways, if you were to compare it to Eisenman, you could say, if Eisenman made these kinds of models but never built anything, you might say he would have a different legacy. So the relationship between how pretty radical ideas get transformed into real buildings, sometimes there are limits to what it is and other people have to take it up. So just to stay on the idea of Fuller-esque form, this is Heinz Isler with engineered form, finding, I know you're doing an airport where Richard Rogers takes form as an engineered kind of world, and Frei Otto, the deceased but awarded Pritzker Prize winner in his famous project in Mannheim, where the hippie and the astronaut shake hands. An idea of a kind of blob morphology, which is still of an attitude that is trying to undercut, you know, status quo design in this big kind of pavilion project. Then on the other hand, of course, you know that all the engineering has been run through it, you know, so deeply, perfectly. Whether it was reverse engineered or pre-engineered, that I don't know. And let's just get to this project and Zaha and parametricism. You know, it's interesting. I think you've seen these lectures. I haven't read Patrick's book. Or books. It's curious to say, besides the fact that he would like for it to be the new 5 points of architecture, or 10 or 50 or whatever they are, as paradigmatic, but it's not a new material project. This is a building made out of steel with a green roof, with nicely shaped aluminum panels on it, same stuff that most people build their buildings out of, played out with new delivery systems and software, but all of that doesn't make any difference, because the argument here, like all of their projects, is the world is immersive and buildings communicate, and buildings need to communicate as a media in the same way that everything else does. And the best way to do that is to make architecture that has these kinds of properties rather than properties that remind you of the discipline itself. So curvature and smoothness and the liquid and all of that, actually Zaha was not the author of that. When Zaha began her office, her main and only manifesto was, I am continuing the unfinished modern project. So if you go back to the texts and things and lectures that she had in 1982, 83, after she won the Peak. My project is to finish the unfinished project. So what's the unfinished project of modernism? And that is not just 5 points of architecture, but what about the issues of dislocation? What about the issues of contemporaneity? What about the issues of speed? The Santilia project. So the only thing she can do is make a project that models that type of energy into an iconic project that says this is that. Patrick comes forward and takes it many, many steps further, kind of connects to his rationalist tradition, uses software, likes to talk about it as a style, and I'm interested in that, but it's a further way to say, well, this isn't really the continuation of the modern project only, even though Zaha was saying today is the modernist project, every day is the condition. He's trying to put it into a world where you can't make another building that has a straight wall or a flat roof because that is dead. And it's a polemic, however you sort of look at it, however it may liberate them, however it may imprison them, because at some point it does preclude a lot of things from happening, but that's part of what we're trying to figure out is issues of discrimination. Okay, so to come back to Wolf, and I've put in, I'm not sure if he's used this particular quote. It looks like punk, but it's still rock and roll, and I like it. Please, I need to send that to Wolf, because as you know, he likes to put in Rolling Stones lyrics. And what's interesting about this project is, did you work on this project? Yeah. This took 15 years or something like that? 15 years. I know right now you're going, I'm not going to be an architect. That's too long. This took 15 years to build. This is the Confluence Museum in Lyon? That's right. Yeah, that's the name of the museum. It took 15 years to build. You've probably seen images of it. And if I were a 15-year-old or 16 or 17-year-old kid walking by, as I did to Paul Rudolph, and I saw that, I go, wow, that's what I want to do. Because what does it say about architecture? It continues, on the one hand, the idea of the polemic of anarchy, but Wolf has always been, the anarchist for the people, which is one of the most misunderstood things I would say about Wolf, and to a certain extent some of his contemporaries. And issues of ugliness, of challenge, of pushback on classical forms of beauty, they all work here, except to say that in the contemporary world, this is not unbeautiful, because the filters and the contexts have changed, for what that is. And this also is not a project about materials. This is a steel building with stainless steel and aluminum panels, with delivery, being able to clearly understand how you're going to negotiate conic surfaces with flat triangular patterns, which makes a nice little local description of those joints and systems, and all of the ways that are beyond me that glazing and roof systems, all come together in a project that's both coherent and incoherent all at the same time. So this is a formalism that ultimately, when you think about a bubble with no material almost to it, it's the same project. And it's a working through of a project to get to the point not of just simply the embrace of architecture, but that building doesn't diminish anything. To me, it only makes it more manifest and more powerful. And when I look at this image, it blows my mind. It makes me go back to that moment when I saw the Rudolph building, almost in the Everest-like sense of it's there after all this time. Okay, my own small contribution in 1996 to that project in making, this is the very first project that I got to build after a long time. I think it was like 38 years old when this happened. And more than anything, I was obsessed with the same questions you were, which is, how can I create a project that has relevance beyond me, even though I would like to contribute something personal? And how do you make those things together? Because I was never interested in being an artist in the Gehry-esque sense. So the rise of the computer, digital technology, the idea of the univocal, everybody's getting access, everybody's speaking the same language, tools are becoming more and more ubiquitous, and they supply content, access, virtual access, didn't have to get on a plane anymore to go to some place, et cetera, et cetera. So it turned the idea of, I was interested in making a global generic, a project that would work anywhere and everywhere, almost the equivalent to an international language or style, because I felt globalization was more and more a confrontation for our work, and it was never a thought about a retreat into the personal, or, well, how could I offer my own small thing that was super eccentric. So this project came out of the idea of, and this is the conceptual leap, what is an architectural project out of that if I know that architecture is made out of materials, has walls, has surfaces, has glass and all of that, because I'm not interested in doing furniture, but I got to get some sort of conceptual leap that's embedded, maybe in this case, with meaning. So all I could think about was the territory of the world being removed from three-dimensionality to two-dimensionality into forms of representation. And then all I said was landforms mean nothing anymore, and it's all water. It's all digital liquid, you know, everywhere all the time. So that's what it turned into, a green surface with nothing on it. That in itself, as it's being roof, wall, partition, table, and so forth, the goal was to try to immediately, it didn't happen overnight, turn it into a project that could, by the way, be built, by the way, be useful, and by the way, say something conceptually provocative about a kind of Gestalt worldview. And it took a while to work through to do that. And while this doesn't look exactly like what we do today, what's embedded in a lot of this is still part of what we're going on. But I feel like this project was a contribution to ways in which a conceptual project could turn into, I would say, a normative architectural project from a building standpoint. Okay, and I'll wrap it up with a few things. Mass in the age of media is not my quote. It's a colleague by the name of Peter Wilson, who was a colleague of Zaha in the 80s. Did anybody see that movie Elysium? Did you see it? It's not good. Anyway, so here's a building. It looks like they took a picture over the 405 and put the aircraft carrier, and then, you know, pasted in a bunch of stuff. And so probably a few architecture students who had gone into the movie business modeled this, and they said, we'd like a building sitting on the landscape, and we want it, you know, to have an image of something that we imagine in this time frame. So it's referential to heavy technology, of course. It's got its nice linear striping and flourishes. It's got the same sort of massing as an aircraft carrier. It's got all the communications gear and stuff on the top. I don't know why they would do that. I think there's going to be other things that allow us to gather signals. And a team puts it on there. They put some green roof on it and so forth. Now, I guess you could graduate from architecture school and go, well, look, why would I want to build anything? Because I can just make buildings, you know, digital, and I'm doing it, and it's for an audience, and they see it, and I'm contributing to culture and life. But I won't have to worry about anything else. So can I be an architect that way? Yeah, you can. But here's El Helicoide in Caracas, a crazy city if you've ever been there, and this is a project that was started from through the 60s and finally abandoned in the 80s, and it was almost never used. You can see what it is. It's a big spiral. It was meant to be a kind of multi-use building, shopping. There's a Fuller Dome on top of it. It's quite large. It lands right in the middle of a city. And while there were a lot of crazy things going on to be able to engender this project, and it's also tectonically, you know, very simple. It's a pyramid. It's a mountain. There's no cantilever. Nothing's going crazy to it. But to me, when I look at this project, I think, even though it's got a checkered history and it's sort of sitting there, and it may simply become a site to make a movie, you know, one day, it still bizarrely gives you faith in the power of context and the power of conditions that, for me, when I look at that, I'm more attracted and more scared and more compelled for sure, then I am that, but that's just me. I'm not really into that kind of entertainment. I'm into this world. I'm into the strange, scary weirdness of what does it mean to pour concrete in this particular type of configuration in a city, and even have it blow up in your face as being a potential possibility. You can do architecture and put it 3,000 feet above the air, and I know Joe Kosinski well, and he was inspired a lot by our projects, and I don't know what atmospheric conditions are like up there for a house of this sort. You suspend all those imaginations and so forth, and I suppose you could do that. But I prefer this. I prefer this image of, this doesn't seem of this earth. That seems to me more weird, way, way more weird. This is way more weird than that. And of course, you know, this is the Allianz Arena. And what's more cool about it is thousands of people get to experience that weirdness, whereas in this image, you know, this otherworldly aspect of it. And why is it otherworldly? Of course, there's no people. There's a reference to nature, but in the mesmerizing self-consistency of this piece of, you know, design, and that it could have its opposite effect, become lit and become a giant magnet or attractor. If you think about your libraries, if you think about your museums, if you think about your airports, you could think about them in those particular ways where they can be purely otherworldly but have them be deeply attractive at the same time. Now, of course, there's a brilliant football team, there's high technology inside the skin, it's got character to it because it can change colors and do all of that stuff, but you also know that it can have this kind of appearance which could just alienate you almost in an attractive kind of way. You couldn't do this project unless you knew that much about it in terms of what its material and potential effects are. It's pretty much just like a piece of industrial design, let's say, brought to a high level. And when you think about these stadium projects, they are almost like scaled up forms of very, very primitive elements. So I show you a few images of these projects before. These are just interesting buildings that I like a lot. This is Gottfried Bohm, what I call the Prismas, the prismatic massive project. This is from the 1960s, one of the most unknown Pritzker Prize winners, and a very you know, if you think about a church, it's curious, you know, you see the interior and the big truncated pyramid in the back surrounded by all these other weirdly truncated prisms that have odd nodules and things on them. And, you know, this is kind of one of the classic brutalist projects. And a more, I would say, refined graphic concrete project, this is in Buenos Aires, where lots and lots of structural gymnastics are going on. The exterior surface is actually not that structural. It's this punch card brise-soleil, a big 2 columns and a big concrete beam that you see on the right. There are big cores that hold up a giant concrete beam that all of the floors are suspended below it. It's you see on the left. It's a project of incredible I would say, elegance and brutality all at the same time. It fits into a city with remarkable kind of fitness on the one hand, but as the corner is kind of excavated out and levitating slabs of concrete where you can actually read the beams and the stiffeners embedded into the wet material. For me, this is one of the great projects that, in essence, I would say, takes material and makes a thesis out of it because it forces concrete into doing so many other things that brutalism didn't do. And I'll end with Tom because he's a figure we should all know about, and it's a local building and you can go see it. And he's also somebody whose career we've tracked quite a bit, and how astonishing he was because of his apparent disinterest in conventions on the one hand of practice, but Tom always drew buildings at the same time. He drew projects of incredible kind of graphic complexity. And so on the one hand, he's been an architect who said that, you know, through drawings like Eisenman, the world consists of many, many things, many systems, political, cultural, site-related, et cetera. And I'm just going to put all of those into the building everywhere all the time. And he had to figure out how to make an architecture out of that. And his thesis, in many ways, is not a thesis that's, I would say, polemical. His is another way of holding the mirror up to the world, which is the world is beautiful and sublime and ugly and problematic and connected and disconnected. It really is a kind of kitchen sink of possibilities. And his endeavor is to say, I don't want anything to escape that. I don't want to almost edit anything out. How can I put it all in? And he finds ways, of course, to use, I think, Corbusian modernism, just like so many other architects have, through those principles, but puts it into a project that says something different. So I would categorize Tom quite differently than I would Frank, for instance, just to bring it back to local architects. I hope I've contextualized the problems of the thesis, why your professors have given you the structure that you've had so it can help you have a conduit and a pathway to make a contribution to rather than just simply own and struggle with interests. I think it's great that you guys have done this and that everybody's buying into it. So thanks very much.